Hi guys, tonight we begin a calm yet gripping journey into one of the most infamous stories of the 20th century. This is the tale of Pablo Escobar, the man who rose from the dusty streets of Colombia to become the most feared and richest drug lord of his time. He built an empire that brought unimaginable wealth, but also cast a shadow of terror over an entire nation. In this series, we will slowly walk through his life, from humble beginnings to the heights of power and the chaos that followed in his wake. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born on December 1st, 1949, in the small town of Rio Negro near Medellin, Colombia. His father was a farmer and his mother a schoolteacher. The family lived modestly, and young Pablo grew up with little luxury. Yet from an early age he carried within him a restless ambition, a drive to escape poverty, and an unshakable belief that he was destined for greatness. Escobar's childhood was not marked by violence or extravagance, but by a hunger for more. He was clever, resourceful, and willing to test boundaries. Friends recalled that as a boy he was already known for bending rules, whether it was sneaking into places he shouldn't be or devising small schemes to make extra money. He sold cigarettes, ran errands, and even resold stolen tombstones for profit. These were early glimpses into a personality that would later find a path in the shadows. In the Medellin of the 1950s and 60s, the city was transforming. Once a quiet town, it was becoming a bustling urban centre, filled with new opportunities, but also new inequalities. Wealthy elites lived in gated neighbourhoods, while the poor crowded into the hillsides, struggling to survive. This gap between rich and poor was not lost on Pablo. He saw it every day and made up his mind that he would never remain on the lower end of society. In his teenage years, Escobar's ambition became more pronounced. He was drawn to figures who carried power, men who commanded respect on the streets, and he began dreaming of becoming rich quickly, by any means necessary. Unlike many of his peers, he did not dream of education or traditional work. Instead, he focused on shortcuts, opportunities where rules could be bent or broken. Stories spread of Pablo boasting that one day he would become the president of Colombia, or if not president, then its richest man. While these words seemed far-fetched to those around him, they showed his boldness and his refusal to accept the limits of his environment. Escobar's first ventures into crime were small but revealing. He and friends were rumoured to steal cars, strip them and resell the parts. At times he was involved in smuggling electronics and simple contraband. These early activities introduced him to the underworld of Medellin, a network of criminals, smugglers and hustlers who thrived in the shadows of the growing city. By the late 1960s, Escobar was building connections with people who would later prove vital to his rise. Medellin, surrounded by mountains and positioned near key trade routes, was already a hub for smuggling. It was here that Escobar learned how networks of trust and fear worked, and how money could silence questions. What set Pablo apart from others in this world was not just his ambition, but his calm patience. He was not reckless for the sake of being reckless. Instead, he planned, observed, and learned, quietly absorbing the lessons of older criminals while waiting for his moment. He had a gift for remembering details, for reading people, and for making himself seem both approachable and dangerous. In his early 20s, Escobar began to accumulate more wealth than the average young man in Medellin could ever imagine. He drove better cars, wore sharper clothes, and began to attract attention. Yet even then, he never forgot the poverty of his childhood. He saw wealth as not just a privilege, but as armour, something that would protect him and lift him above the vulnerabilities of ordinary life. And so, in the quiet beginnings of his story, we see the outlines of a man who would change the history of Colombia forever. A man who grew up surrounded by inequality, and decided that he would not accept his place at the bottom. Instead, he set his eyes on the top, and he was willing to pay any price to get there. This was the first chapter of Pablo Escobar's life, where ambition, hunger, and restlessness laid the foundation for everything that would follow. Pablo Escobar's first real steps into the underworld came through contraband. Colombia in the late 1960s was a nation marked by political unrest, poverty, and a struggling economy. Everyday goods were often expensive or difficult to obtain legally, and this created opportunities for young men who were willing to operate outside the law. Escobar began by smuggling small items like electronics, liquor, and cigarettes, products that could be purchased cheaply abroad and sold for a profit in Medellin. These operations may have seemed minor at the time, but they introduced him to the mechanics of supply chains, bribery, and the art of moving goods discreetly. The business of contraband taught Pablo lessons that would stay with him for life. He discovered how borders could be porous with the right amount of money in the right hands. Police officers, customs officials, and local politicians were often underpaid and susceptible to bribes. Escobar realized that money could buy silence, and silence was the key to expanding any illegal enterprise. This understanding would later become one of the cornerstones of his empire. The idea that loyalty could be secured through fear, but also through financial reward. As his confidence grew, Escobar began to expand his activities. Car theft became another venture, with vehicles stolen, altered, and resold for profit. It was dangerous work, but it made him bold and more connected in the criminal community. Escobar was developing a reputation as someone who could be trusted to get things done, someone who kept his word but also demanded respect in return. By his early 20s, Pablo had outgrown the small hustles of his teenage years. He was looking for bigger opportunities, and fate was about to offer him one. The global demand for narcotics was rising, particularly in the United States, where the counterculture of the late 1960s and early 1970s created a booming market for drugs. Marijuana was the first major product to be smuggled on a large scale from Colombia, and young men like Escobar saw a chance to make money beyond their wildest dreams. Escobar quickly recognized that this new trade could transform his life. Unlike contraband electronics or stolen cars, marijuana brought profits that multiplied rapidly, and the risks, though high, seemed worth taking. He invested in connections with growers, distributors, and smugglers, learning every step of the process. The mountains of Colombia, fertile and hidden, were ideal for cultivation, and the country's long coastlines offered routes for transportation. Escobar's reputation grew further as he showed an unusual ability to organize people. He was not just a thug or a hustler, he was a strategist. He knew how to build loyalty by sharing profits, how to keep order by punishing betrayal, and how to expand his reach without drawing unnecessary attention. He often mixed charm with menace, making it clear that working with him was profitable, but crossing him was dangerous. These years marked the beginning of Escobar's transformation from a street-level smuggler into a man who could envision a true empire. He was still far from becoming the king of cocaine, but the seeds were being planted. Step by step, he was moving closer to the world stage, guided by an ambition that would stop at nothing. By the early 1970s, Pablo Escobar's ambitions pushed him beyond the trade in marijuana. A new substance was gaining ground internationally, especially in the United States. Cocaine. What had once been a little-known drug was becoming a luxury product, first among wealthy elites and later across entire cities. For Escobar, this was not just another opportunity. It was the opening of a door that could make him richer and more powerful than he had ever dreamed. Cocaine production was different from marijuana. It required laboratories, chemical knowledge, and an efficient system to move the product abroad. Escobar learned quickly, recruiting chemists to process coca leaves into the white powder that buyers demanded. In Colombia, the coca leaf was not new. Indigenous communities had used it for centuries in traditional ways. But Escobar saw how the refined product could be exported in bulk, and he realized that Colombia's geography, its jungles, mountains, and long coastlines, made it the perfect hub for such an operation. Escobar was not alone in recognizing this. Other groups and individuals were also beginning to experiment with cocaine smuggling. but he distinguished himself through organization and vision. He was not content to run small shipments. He wanted control of an entire chain, from growers to transporters to distributors. He saw the importance of scale, understanding that profits multiplied dramatically when operations were coordinated rather than scattered. To achieve this, Escobar built networks of trust. He knew when to be generous, ensuring that farmers, pilots, and local collaborators earned enough to stay loyal. But he also made it clear that betrayal would be met with swift consequences. In his world, respect was a currency as valuable as money. Escobar's charisma helped him here. He could be warm and persuasive, convincing people to join him, while also projecting a quiet menace that warned against disobedience. One of Escobar's early strategies was to use airplanes for smuggling. Small planes could carry cocaine over borders undetected, landing in secret airstrips or even dropping loads mid-flight for pickup. He invested heavily in this system, buying planes, hiring skilled pilots, and bribing officials to look the other way. These flights became legendary, not only for their daring, but for the enormous sums of money they generated. By the mid-1970s, Escobar was already earning more than most Colombian businessmen would in a lifetime. His wealth allowed him to buy properties, cars, and influence. He began to appear in public as a man of importance, even respectability, though few outside the underworld knew the true source of his riches. Yet, despite his growing success, Escobar remained cautious. He understood that drawing too much attention could endanger his operations. At this stage, he preferred to work quietly, building his network, refining his methods, and preparing for expansion. What began as a bold experiment was quickly turning into a vast enterprise. Escobar was no longer just a smuggler. He was becoming a figure of power, someone who shaped the flow of goods across borders. In the shadows of Colombia, a new empire was being born, and its architect was a man whose hunger for control knew no bounds. As the cocaine trade expanded, Pablo Escobar began to refine the structure of his operations. What had started as a collection of smugglers and pilots slowly evolved into something more organized. A true network that would soon be known as the Medellin Cartel. Escobar was at the center of it, a man who understood that power came from coordination and discipline. He brought together other ambitious traffickers, creating alliances that allowed them to dominate production and distribution. Unlike many criminals who fought for short-term gains, Escobar thought in terms of systems. He invested in laboratories hidden deep in the jungle, where coca leaves could be processed far from the eyes of the authorities. These facilities were guarded, supplied, and maintained with military-like precision. For every kilo that left Colombia, profits multiplied several times once the product reached American cities. Escobar knew that consistency and reliability were just as important as secrecy. Pilots who worked for him recalled the remarkable organization of his smuggling routes. Aircrafts were carefully scheduled, loads were calculated to maximize efficiency, and backup plans were always in place. The cartel also used boats, trucks, and even submarines for transportation. Escobar's empire did not rely on luck. It relied on careful planning supported by bribes and intimidation. Money flowed back to Colombia in staggering amounts. By the late 1970s, Escobar was already one of the richest men in the country. He purchased estates, farms, and luxurious homes. His most famous property, Hacienda Nápoles, became a symbol of his wealth. The estate featured a private zoo with exotic animals, swimming pools, and even a collection of vintage cars. For Escobar, this was not just indulgence, it was a statement of power, proof that he had risen far above his humble beginnings. Yet, with wealth came visibility. Escobar was no longer a shadow figure in Medellin. He appeared in newspapers, sponsored community projects, and began cultivating an image as a man of the people. He donated money to the poor, built housing in slums, and funded sports fields for children. These gestures won him genuine admiration among Colombia's lower classes, who began to see him not just as a criminal, but as a benefactor who cared about them when the government seemed absent. This dual identity, both feared trafficker and admired patron, was central to Escobar's rise. He understood the value of public opinion. If people loved him, they would protect him. If they felt indebted to him, they would remain silent about his crimes. Escobar turned generosity into a shield, one that often proved more effective than violence. Still, beneath the surface, the reality was darker. Every shipment depended on corruption. Every bribe reinforced the erosion of Colombia's institutions, and every rival who challenged him was quickly silenced. Escobar's organization was growing into something that reached beyond business. It was becoming a parallel power, one that challenged the authority of the state itself. By the late 1970s, Pablo Escobar had firmly established himself as one of the dominant figures in the cocaine trade. His influence stretched far beyond Medellin, reaching across borders into Panama, the Caribbean, and ultimately the United States. The demand for cocaine in North America seemed endless, and Escobar positioned himself as the man who could supply it reliably and in massive quantities. What made Escobar's organization so effective was its scale. He was not shipping kilos, he was shipping tons. Cargo planes filled with cocaine departed from Colombia's secret airstrips and landed in remote areas of Florida, where the product was distributed further by trusted partners. Other routes passed through Central America, where governments and officials could be bribed to allow the trade to continue without interference. Escobar had mastered the art of logistics, turning smuggling into a multinational operation. With the profits, Escobar's wealth exploded. At its peak, his cartel was believed to be bringing in millions of dollars every single day. Money was hidden in warehouses, buried in fields, or stuffed into walls because banks could not handle the volume without drawing suspicion. Stories spread of Escobar losing millions each year to rats and mold. Yet the flow of money was so great that such losses hardly mattered. Wealth on this scale gave Escobar unprecedented power. Bribery became not an occasional tool, but a permanent system. Judges, police officers, customs officials, and even politicians were quietly placed on the cartel's payroll. Escobar had a simple philosophy. Everyone had a price. If money could not buy their silence, fear would. This approach came to be summed up in his infamous phrase, "silver or lead," meaning take the bribe or face the bullet. Yet Escobar also continued to cultivate his image as a man of the people. In Medellin, he funded entire neighborhoods for the poor, providing housing to families who had lived in shacks. He built clinics, schools, and soccer fields, creating a sense of loyalty among communities that felt ignored by the government. To many of the poor, Escobar was not a criminal at all, but a hero who gave them dignity and opportunity. This contradiction defined much of his rise. He was both a benefactor and a criminal mastermind. The Colombian government grew increasingly alarmed as Escobar's power expanded. Officials realized that the cartel was no longer just a criminal group. It was becoming a parallel authority capable of undermining the state itself. In many areas, people feared the cartel more than they respected the government. For Escobar, this was precisely the point. His ambition was not simply to run a business, but to reshape power in Colombia to his advantage. By the dawn of the 1980s, he was no longer just another trafficker. He was becoming a national force, a man whose wealth, violence, and popularity gave him the ability to challenge anyone who stood in his way. As Pablo Escobar's fortune multiplied, his ambitions began to stretch into the political sphere. For him, wealth alone was not enough. Power, he believed, required legitimacy, and legitimacy could be found through politics. Escobar envisioned a future where he would not only control the streets, but also sit at the same tables as Colombia's elite. In the early 1980s, he began funding political campaigns, making donations and building alliances with local politicians who benefited from his financial backing. His generosity to the poor also doubled as political capital. Communities he supported praised him, and some local leaders saw an opportunity to turn his popularity into votes. Escobar carefully crafted an image of himself as a successful businessman and philanthropist, avoiding direct reference to his criminal empire. His speeches highlighted themes of social justice, opportunity, and the responsibility of the wealthy to uplift the poor. In 1982, his ambitions bore fruit when he was elected as an alternate member of the Colombian Congress. For Escobar, this was a triumph. He now carried the title of a statesman, rubbing shoulders with figures who once looked down on him. However, this step into the public eye also brought new scrutiny. Journalists and rival politicians began questioning the origins of his wealth. His carefully maintained image as a businessman was under threat. One notable confrontation occurred with Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, a rising political figure who openly denounced Escobar. Lara accused him of being a trafficker, bringing unwanted attention to Escobar's past. At first, Escobar tried to maintain composure, dismissing the accusations. But the tide of suspicion was growing. International pressure also mounted. The United States, alarmed by the influx of cocaine, began pressing the Colombian government to crack down on traffickers. Escobar's name was appearing in reports that linked him directly to the trade, and the thin veil of legitimacy he had built was starting to tear apart. Escobar's time in politics was brief. By 1984, his congressional career collapsed under the weight of scandal, and he resigned his position. Yet this failure did not weaken him. It hardened him. He realized that the traditional structures of politics were not built for him. Instead of playing by their rules, he would bend the rules of the state itself. This turning point was crucial. Escobar abandoned the idea of becoming a legitimate political leader and embraced his role as an outsider with his own form of power. For those who opposed him, this was a dangerous shift. Escobar, no longer bound by appearances, would increasingly rely on intimidation, bribery, and violence to shape outcomes. From this moment forward, his war with the state began to take clearer form. The collapse of Pablo Escobar's political ambitions marked a turning point in his life. Stripped of the thin veil of legitimacy he had sought, he turned fully toward the empire he had built in the shadows. By the mid-1980s, the Medellin cartel was no longer just a powerful organization. It was a global force, and Escobar was at its center. His wealth was almost beyond imagination. Estimates suggested that the cartel supplied as much as 80% of the cocaine entering the United States, generating billions of dollars each year. The money was so vast that it created logistical problems. Cartel accountants bought rubber bands by the ton to wrap stacks of bills, and warehouses filled with cash needed constant rotation to avoid decay. Escobar reportedly spent thousands of dollars each month simply on elastic bands. The fortune made him one of the richest men in the world, and yet money was only part of his power. Escobar had mastered the art of fear. Those who opposed him faced a brutal choice: accept a bribe or risk their lives. Judges, police, journalists, and even government officials found themselves targeted. In 1984, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the justice minister who had denounced Escobar, was assassinated in Bogotá. The killing shocked Colombia and confirmed what many already knew, that Escobar would go to any length to silence his enemies. This murder marked the beginning of open conflict between Escobar and the Colombian state. The government, under pressure from the United States, vowed to crack down on the cartel. Extradition treaties were signed, allowing Colombian traffickers to be sent to the US to face trial. For Escobar, extradition was a nightmare scenario. In his view, better a grave in Colombia than a cell in the United States. This belief became the foundation of his war against extradition, a war that would define the next phase of his life. Escobar responded to government pressure with calculated violence. Car bombs, assassinations, and kidnappings became tools of his campaign. His reach extended beyond Colombia's borders, but it was at home that his wrath was most deeply felt. He targeted politicians who supported extradition, judges who dared to rule against him, and journalists who exposed cartel crimes. To many Colombians, the 1980s became an era of terror, where daily life was overshadowed by fear of violence. Yet even as the bloodshed mounted, Escobar maintained his dual image. In poor neighborhoods of Medellin, he continued building housing, schools, and soccer fields. Children wore jerseys with his name, and families spoke of him with admiration. He was a paradox, both destroyer and provider, feared villain and beloved benefactor. This tension between his public generosity and private ruthlessness became the defining feature of his reign. Escobar was no longer just a trafficker, he was now a figure whose shadow stretched across an entire nation. By the mid-1980s, Pablo Escobar had achieved what few could imagine: near total dominance of the international cocaine trade. His cartel's influence extended from the coca fields of the Andes to the nightclubs of Miami and the streets of New York. Airplanes, boats, and hidden routes funneled product northward in astonishing volumes, while money poured back into Colombia in an endless stream. This system required not only ruthless enforcement, but also remarkable organization. Escobar oversaw a network that resembled a multinational corporation. He managed chemists who refined coca paste into cocaine, pilots who flew shipments across borders, accountants who laundered profits, and armed enforcers who protected every link in the chain. Loyalty was demanded, and betrayal was unforgivable. Yet despite the cartel's sophistication, its operations always relied on two foundations: fear and corruption. Escobar's philosophy of plata o plomo, silver or lead, meant that every official, from police officers to politicians, had to make a choice. Most accepted the silver, preferring bribes to bullets. This system allowed Escobar to operate with astonishing freedom, undermining Colombia's institutions at every level. The Medellin cartel was not just a criminal enterprise, it was a parallel state, with its own laws and punishments. Escobar's wealth insulated him from many dangers. At Hacienda Nápoles, his luxurious estate, he lived like royalty. The sprawling property featured swimming pools, artificial lakes, a private zoo, and even a small airport for his planes. Guests were treated to lavish parties where exotic animals roamed the grounds. For Escobar, this estate was not only a home but also a symbol of triumph, proof that he had risen from poverty to unimaginable heights. Yet his extravagance also drew attention. Journalists documented his lifestyle, while foreign governments pressed Colombia to act. The United States, alarmed by the flood of cocaine, increased its involvement in Colombian affairs. DEA agents expanded operations, gathering intelligence and pressuring local authorities to crack down. Escobar, in turn, viewed this foreign interference as a direct threat to his empire. Violence escalated. Judges who ruled against traffickers were assassinated. Police officers who refused bribes were targeted. Politicians who supported extradition lived under constant fear. Bombings shook cities, spreading terror among ordinary citizens. Escobar's war against the state was not hidden. It was deliberate, a message to anyone who challenged him. Still, in the barrios of Medellin, his reputation remained complex. Families who received housing or food from his program saw him as a savior. Children played in parks he had built, unaware of the violence tied to his name. This duality, beloved by some, hated by others, gave Escobar a power that traditional institutions struggled to counter. He had built not just an empire of cocaine, but an empire of perception. To his supporters, he was the man who cared when no one else did. To his enemies, he was the most dangerous criminal Colombia had ever known. The mid-1980s brought a new intensity to Pablo Escobar's war with the Colombian government. At the heart of the conflict was the issue of extradition. The United States demanded that traffickers captured in Colombia be sent north to stand trial. For Escobar, this was an intolerable threat. He believed that setting foot in a US courtroom would mean the end of his empire, his freedom, and his carefully cultivated image. Determined to prevent it, he unleashed a campaign of violence designed to intimidate anyone who supported extradition. Judges were the first targets. Courtrooms became dangerous places where rulings against cartel interest could mean death. Entire families of magistrates were threatened, and some judges resigned rather than risk their lives. Others were not given the choice. Assassinations became headlines, shocking the nation and revealing just how far Escobar was willing to go. Politicians also felt the weight of his wrath. Members of Congress who spoke in favor of extradition found themselves living under constant fear. Campaigns were disrupted by threats, and rallies were overshadowed by explosions. Escobar's message was clear. Supporting extradition was a death sentence. The Medellin cartel even expanded its war into the streets, using car bombs in busy areas to create chaos. Ordinary citizens became victims in a battle they had never chosen. For many Colombians, daily life now carried a shadow of fear. Walking through cities meant wondering if violence would strike without warning. Escobar was not trying to win hearts with these actions. He was trying to paralyze the state through terror. Yet, in the barrios of Medellin, his generosity continued. Families received food baskets, schools were funded, and sports programs flourished. Escobar used charity to maintain a base of loyalty, ensuring that even as the government branded him an enemy of the nation, he remained a hero to the poor. This contradiction deepened the country's divisions. Some saw him as the cause of endless suffering, while others believed he was the only one who cared for the forgotten. Internationally, pressure mounted. The United States increased its cooperation with Colombia, providing resources and intelligence to combat the cartel. DEA agents worked alongside Colombian forces, marking the beginning of a long and difficult partnership. Escobar viewed this alliance as a declaration of war, and his attacks grew even more brutal. The conflict was no longer about business. It was about survival. Escobar had tied his fate to the fight against extradition, and he was willing to bring an entire nation into chaos to protect himself. By the late 1980s, Colombia was trapped in a storm of violence where the lines between politics, law, and crime blurred beyond recognition. By the late 1980s, Pablo Escobar's name had become synonymous with both fear and fascination. He was no longer just a wealthy trafficker. He was a national figure whose actions shaped the daily lives of Colombians. His war against extradition escalated into a campaign that reached every corner of society. The tactic was simple but devastating. Spread enough fear that institutions would bend or collapse. One of Escobar's most infamous strategies was the use of car bombs in urban centres. Explosions ripped through streets, offices, and even government buildings, leaving destruction in their wake. Ordinary people became victims, and cities like Bogotá and Medellin carried the scars of a conflict that felt endless. The unpredictability of the violence created constant anxiety. For many, leaving home each day meant stepping into uncertainty, never knowing if the next blast was moments away. Escobar's ability to finance such attacks came directly from the immense profits of the cocaine trade. With billions at his disposal, he could fund operations that rivaled those of small armies. Weapons, vehicles, and explosives were readily available, and loyal followers carried out his orders with precision. His cartel became more than a business. It became a force capable of challenging the state itself. Yet even amid this brutality, Escobar continued to cultivate his image as a benefactor. In Medellin's poorest neighborhoods, he remained a figure of admiration. He provided housing through projects known as Barrios de Pablo, built soccer fields, and distributed money to families who had little else. These acts created a bond of loyalty that the government struggled to break. To many of the poor, Escobar was not a villain but a protector, someone who gave them opportunities that the state never provided. This dual identity, terrorist and philanthropist, confused and divided public opinion. Internationally, Escobar's actions drew fierce condemnation. The United States increased its involvement, sending financial aid and training to Colombian forces tasked with dismantling the cartel. American newspapers featured stories of his wealth and violence, portraying him as one of the most dangerous criminals in the world. Escobar, however, saw himself differently. In his own mind, he was a patriot defending Colombian sovereignty against foreign interference. His war against extradition was framed not just as self-preservation, but as resistance to outside domination. This narrative resonated with some Colombians, further complicating the struggle. By this point, Escobar had crossed a threshold. He was no longer simply protecting his empire. He was waging open war against the state. Colombia, caught in the middle, faced a level of instability that threatened its very foundations. The battle lines were drawn, and Escobar showed no sign of retreat. As the war escalated, Pablo Escobar realized that fear alone could not guarantee his safety. He needed leverage, and he found it in the form of kidnappings. High-profile abductions became one of his most effective weapons against the Colombian state. By targeting the families of politicians, journalists, and influential figures, Escobar created bargaining chips that he could use to pressure the government. Each kidnapping was carefully planned, with victims chosen for their symbolic and political value. Some were released after negotiations, while others disappeared forever, their fate serving as a grim reminder of Escobar's power. These acts were not random cruelty. They were part of a calculated strategy to bend institutions to his will. In 1989, Escobar struck one of his boldest blows by ordering the assassination of Luis Carlos Galán, a presidential candidate who openly supported extradition and vowed to dismantle the cartels. Galán was gunned down at a rally, shocking the nation and sending a message that even the highest office in Colombia was not beyond Escobar's reach. The killing marked a turning point. Colombians who had once admired Escobar's generosity began to question whether his violence had gone too far. International outrage also surged, and the United States intensified its pressure on the Colombian government to act decisively. Escobar responded by unleashing even greater terror. That same year, he authorized one of the most notorious acts of violence in Colombian history, the bombing of Avianca Flight 203. The explosion killed all 107 people on board, including innocent civilians, in a failed attempt to assassinate another political rival. The attack horrified the world and stripped away much of the sympathy Escobar had cultivated. He was no longer seen as just a benefactor of the poor, but as a terrorist capable of mass murder. Despite this, Escobar's reach remained vast. He controlled entire neighborhoods, influenced elections, and maintained a network of loyal enforcers who carried out his orders without hesitation. His empire functioned like a state within a state, complete with its own rules and its own form of justice. For ordinary Colombians, life became a balancing act of fear and survival. Some continued to support him, grateful for his gifts and protection. Others despised him, mourning the endless violence that stained their cities. By the early 1990s, Escobar's war had transformed Colombia into one of the most dangerous places in the world. His defiance of extradition had become a national crisis, and the government, under intense domestic and international pressure, was forced to consider drastic measures. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define not only Escobar's fate, but the future of the country itself. By the early 1990s, Pablo Escobar's war against extradition had reached its most violent stage. The Colombian government, overwhelmed by constant bombings, assassinations and kidnappings, faced mounting pressure from the public and the international community to restore order. The country's institutions were fragile, and Escobar's cartel seemed almost untouchable. Yet Escobar himself understood that even his vast resources had limits. His enemies were multiplying, and he needed a new strategy. Out of this desperation came one of the strangest chapters of his story, his decision to negotiate his own imprisonment. Escobar offered to surrender to authorities under one condition, that he would not be extradited to the United States. For him, staying in Colombia, even behind bars, was preferable to facing justice abroad. After years of terror, the government reluctantly agreed, hoping that his surrender would bring peace to the nation. In 1991, Escobar walked into custody on his own terms, but his version of prison was unlike anything the world had seen. The facility, which came to be known as La Catedral, was designed and built according to his specifications. Perched on a hillside overlooking Medellin, it was less a prison than a fortress. Inside, Escobar enjoyed comforts unimaginable to ordinary inmates. La Catedral included a soccer field, a bar, luxurious furnishings, and even a waterfall. Friends, family, and associates could visit freely, turning the prison into a headquarters rather than a place of punishment. Guards were chosen by Escobar himself, ensuring that his control remained absolute. From within La Catedral, Escobar continued to run his empire. Cartel operations went on as usual, with instructions flowing from the prison walls to the outside world. To many Colombians, it was a mockery of justice. While ordinary citizens suffered from violence and poverty, Escobar enjoyed a life of luxury under the guise of imprisonment. Yet for a brief moment, the violence on the streets subsided. His surrender had brought the government temporary relief, and many hoped it might signal a turning point. But Escobar was not a man who accepted limits. Soon reports surfaced that he was using La Catedral to settle scores with rivals. Murders were carried out within its walls, and bodies disappeared into the surrounding hills. The illusion of peace began to crumble. International observers, particularly from the United States, grew frustrated with Colombia's inability to restrain him. Pressure mounted once again, and the government faced the reality that Escobar's prison had become a sanctuary. What was intended as a solution had instead deepened the problem, leaving Colombia once again at the mercy of Escobar's will. The illusion of control at La Catedral collapsed in 1992. Reports that Pablo Escobar had tortured and killed two of his own associates inside the prison reached the Colombian government, igniting outrage. The arrangement that had once seemed like a fragile peace now appeared as a national embarrassment. Escobar had turned his prison into a palace and continued to rule his empire unchecked. Under mounting pressure from both Colombian citizens and the United States, the government announced plans to transfer Escobar to a standard facility where his power would be limited. But Escobar, always several steps ahead, refused to accept such a move. As officials prepared to enforce the transfer, he simply walked out of La Catedral with the help of loyal guards, disappearing into the mountains. His escape humiliated the government and triggered one of the largest manhunts in Colombian history. Now, free once more, Escobar returned to a life on the run. Yet this time, the landscape had shifted. His escape destroyed what remained of his political protection. The state, backed heavily by US intelligence and resources, was determined to bring him down. Specialized units were formed, including an elite task force known as the Search Bloc, whose sole mission was to capture him. For Escobar, life became a cycle of constant movement. Safe houses across Medellin and the countryside provided shelter, but none for long. Authorities tracked phone calls, raided hideouts, and pressured his network. Each day demanded caution. He rarely slept in the same place twice, and relied on a shrinking circle of trusted allies. At the same time, Escobar faced new threats from rivals. The Cali cartel, once partners in the cocaine trade, saw an opportunity to weaken their Medellin competitor. They quietly supported efforts to hunt him, funding groups like Los Pepes, a vigilante organization composed of former associates and enemies. Los Pepes targeted Escobar's family, lawyers, and business connections, systematically dismantling his support system with brutal efficiency. For Escobar, the world he had built with such care was unravelling. His fortune, though immense, was harder to manage while on the run. Vast sums of money lay buried or hidden, inaccessible during his flight. His family lived under constant fear, forced to move frequently and rely on armed guards for survival. The man who once ruled like a king was now a fugitive, trapped in the very country he had sought to dominate. Despite these pressures, Escobar remained defiant. He believed his charisma and cunning could outlast the government's campaign. But his enemies were closing in from every direction, and the walls around him were growing tighter with each passing month. After his dramatic escape from La Catedral, Pablo Escobar entered the most dangerous chapter of his life. No longer shielded by politics or his carefully cultivated public image, he was now the most wanted man in Colombia. The government, heavily supported by the United States, poured resources into the hunt. The Search Bloc, an elite police unit, grew larger and more sophisticated, armed with technology and intelligence that Escobar could not easily evade. Yet Escobar was not a man to give up easily. He relied on his deep network of safe houses scattered across Medellin and the countryside. Each house was equipped with escape routes, secret tunnels, and stockpiles of weapons and cash. His movements were carefully planned, and he rarely spent more than a few nights in the same location. Loyal guards and lieutenants surrounded him, providing constant protection. Despite his precautions, Escobar's world was shrinking. Every phone call he made was a risk, every ally a potential traitor. The once sprawling Medellin cartel began to fracture under pressure. Rival cartels, particularly the Cali cartel, saw his vulnerability and took advantage. They worked closely with law enforcement, offering intelligence in exchange for leniency. Groups like Los Pepes intensified their campaign, targeting Escobar's family members, lawyers, and businesses. One by one, his connections were destroyed, leaving him increasingly isolated. For the Colombian people, this period was marked by both relief and uncertainty. While Escobar was no longer able to unleash large-scale bombings as he once had, his presence still cast a shadow of fear. Rumors of his whereabouts fueled tension in Medellin, and raids often turned neighborhoods into battlegrounds. The poor communities that had once adored him began to suffer as the violence spilled into their streets. Escobar himself became more cautious, but also more desperate. He longed to protect his family, who were forced into hiding and moved from one safe location to another. His wife and children lived in constant danger, targeted by rivals and stalked by the authorities. Escobar made attempts to negotiate surrender once again, seeking guarantees against extradition, but by this point the government refused. Too much blood had been spilled and too much damage done. What had once been his greatest strength, his ability to balance fear with generosity, was gone. He was left with only fear, and even that was losing its power. The man who once commanded billions of dollars and ruled a nation through terror was now reduced to running from rooftop to rooftop, searching for refuge. His empire was collapsing, his enemies were united, and his time was running out. By 1993, Pablo Escobar's life had become a desperate struggle to survive. Once the undisputed king of the cocaine trade, he was now a hunted man, trapped within the very city he had once ruled. Medellin, with its steep hills and crowded neighborhoods, offered hiding places, but it also left him cornered. Every street and alley carried danger. Every knock on the door could signal betrayal. The search block tightened its grip daily. With advanced surveillance technology provided by the United States, they tracked phone signals, monitored radio chatter, and relied on informants willing to trade information for money or safety. Each call Escobar made to his family risked exposure, yet he could not resist reaching out to them. His love for his wife and children was one of his few remaining vulnerabilities, and the authorities exploited it relentlessly. Meanwhile, his enemies outside the government grew bolder. Los Pepes, backed by rivals and quietly tolerated by some officials, targeted Escobar's network with ruthless efficiency. Associates who had once sworn loyalty were eliminated or forced into hiding. Businesses were destroyed, and family members were harassed or killed. These attacks broke down the structure of Escobar's empire faster than government raids alone could. Escobar's fortune, once beyond comprehension, became less useful as his mobility shrank. Vast caches of cash were hidden in the countryside, but retrieving them was dangerous. Stories circulated of millions lost to mold, water damage, or simple inaccessibility. The wealth that had once bought him power was now scattered, and in many ways useless. Despite his desperation, Escobar remained defiant. He still saw himself as a man destined to outwit his enemies. He frequently shifted between hideouts, relying on his intimate knowledge of Medellin's neighborhoods to stay one step ahead. He disguised himself, moved at odd hours, and maintained strict routines of caution. Yet paranoia haunted him. Friends and family recalled that he became increasingly distrustful, questioning even those closest to him. His health declined under the constant stress, and his once extravagant lifestyle was replaced by exhaustion and fear. For the Colombian government, Escobar's weakening position was both a relief and a danger. He was less capable of orchestrating large-scale attacks, but his desperation made him unpredictable. Authorities worried that he might unleash one final wave of terror in a last attempt to force negotiations. The country, scarred by years of bloodshed, waited anxiously for the end of a man who had defined an era of violence. The walls around him were closing in, and though he refused to accept it, Escobar was living his final days as a fugitive. Pablo Escobar's final months were marked by constant tension, a life reduced to narrow corridors, shuttered windows, and fleeting whispers on phone lines. He moved through Medellin like a ghost, slipping between safe houses arranged by the few loyal men who had not betrayed him. Each hideout was modest compared to the palaces he once enjoyed. Cramped apartments in working-class neighbourhoods, places chosen because they blended into the chaos of the city. For a man who had once flaunted exotic animals, vintage cars and private jets, the contrast was striking. Still, Escobar refused to surrender. He believed that as long as he lived, there was a chance to rebuild. His mind remained sharp, crafting plans for escape or negotiation. He even dreamed of leaving Colombia altogether, plotting routes that might take him to countries without extradition agreements. But his enemy's reach was long, and each attempt to move beyond Medellin was cut short by surveillance or betrayal. Escobar's family remained his greatest concern. His wife, son, and daughter had been forced into a nomadic existence, shielded by bodyguards yet constantly pursued. In recorded conversations, his tone revealed both tenderness and desperation. He tried to reassure them, promising safety that he could no longer guarantee. These calls became his undoing, as authorities tracked his voice through radio triangulation. While the government hunted Escobar relentlessly, Los Pepes continued their campaign of destruction. They burned properties, executed former allies, and sent messages written in blood. Their actions weakened Escobar's power base more effectively than military raids, isolating him from the network he had spent decades building. Medellin itself seemed to turn against him. Where he was once adored as a benefactor, he was now viewed with growing resentment. Residents were weary of the endless violence, the fear that gripped their neighbourhoods, and the stigma his name brought to the city. The once powerful myth of Escobar as a man of the people was fading. Still, in his mind, he remained untouchable. He often boasted to those around him that no government could ever truly capture him. His confidence masked a darker reality. His empire was gone, his allies were vanishing, and his days were numbered. Each morning he awoke to uncertainty, listening for sirens or footsteps on the stairs, never sure if it would be his last day of freedom. For Escobar, who had risen from poverty to command billions, the world had narrowed to a few square blocks. The king of cocaine, once feared across continents, was now cornered in the very city that had crowned him. Pablo Escobar's final year unfolded like a slow collapse, a man once at the height of power reduced to shadows and whispers. By late 1993, the walls around him were nearly closed. The search bloc, strengthened by US intelligence and technology, tightened its grip on Medellin. Los Pepes continued their brutal campaign, erasing what was left of his support system. Rivals circled like vultures waiting for his downfall. For Escobar, every day was a delicate balance between survival and despair. He rarely ventured outside his hideouts, relying on a dwindling circle of loyalists to move him through the city. Gone were the days of luxury convoys, armed motorcades, and lavish estates. Now his world consisted of small apartments with peeling paint, mattresses on floors, and whispered conversations carried out under flickering light bulbs. He still kept bundles of cash within arm's reach, but money had lost much of its power. Bribes no longer guaranteed loyalty. Fear no longer ensured silence. His enemies had multiplied, and even trusted allies looked at him with uncertainty. Escobar's paranoia grew. He suspected betrayal at every corner, often moving between safe houses after only a night or two. His appearance changed as well. He gained weight, His hair thinned, and the stress carved deep lines into his face. He disguised himself with simple clothes to blend in with ordinary residents, but his unmistakable aura of command made anonymity nearly impossible. Despite the decline, Escobar clung to his vision of himself as a leader. He continued reaching out to his family, calling them on unsecured lines even when he knew authorities were listening. In those conversations, he revealed his softer side, speaking with tenderness to his children and desperation to his wife. These calls betrayed both his humanity and his greatest weakness. He could not sever ties with those he loved. Each phone call became a beacon for the search block, narrowing the hunt. Medellin itself was weary of him. The city had once cheered when he built homes, schools and soccer fields, but years of violence had changed public opinion. Car bombs, assassinations, and the Avianca disaster left scars that could not be erased by gifts. For many residents, Escobar's name brought only grief. Internationally, his legend was cemented. Newspapers painted him as the most dangerous outlaw in the world, a man whose empire had shaken entire nations. Yet behind those headlines was a man pacing the floor of a cramped apartment, waiting for the inevitable. He still dreamed of escape, perhaps to a country without extradition, but the noose was tightening. His empire was gone, his rivals were united, and the government had resolved that only death would end his reign. Pablo Escobar, once untouchable, was living on borrowed time. The final chapter of Pablo Escobar's story accelerated in the last months of 1993. The search block, armed with advanced tracking equipment and aided by intelligence from the United States, closed in on his shrinking world. Every intercepted phone call, every whispered word chipped away at his hiding places. Escobar, who once commanded billions and armies of loyal men, now relied on only a handful of bodyguards. The man who had ruled Colombia like a shadow king was living like a cornered fugitive. Despite his desperation, Escobar never stopped plotting. He still believed he might outsmart the government, imagining escape routes, safe territories, and negotiations that could save him from extradition. He frequently shifted between modest safe houses, always carrying bundles of cash to bribe locals or pay for food and shelter. But money was no longer the shield it had once been. Too many feared the consequences of helping him, and too many others saw profit in betraying him. Medellin, once his fortress, became a cage. Escobar's enemies moved freely, targeting his family and remaining allies. Los Pepes burned properties, eliminated former associates, and dismantled the financial network that had kept him afloat. His loved ones lived in constant fear, often moving under the cover of night to avoid attacks. Escobar's calls to them grew longer, more emotional, and more reckless. He clung to his identity as a father and husband even as it endangered him. The very thing that gave him comfort, the sound of his family's voices, became the tool that sealed his fate. His health declined under the relentless pressure. Once robust and commanding, Escobar became heavier, slower, and visibly older than his 44 years. Paranoia clouded his judgment, and even his loyal guards noticed his weariness. The man who had once controlled an empire seemed increasingly like a prisoner of his own fear. On December 2nd, 1993, one day after his 44th birthday, his luck finally ran out. Authorities traced a phone call he made to his son, pinpointing the signal to a modest house in a Medellin neighborhood. The search block surrounded the building, preparing for the confrontation they had pursued for years. Escobar, realizing the trap was closing, attempted to escape across the rooftops, exchanging gunfire with police as he fled. But the chase ended quickly. He was shot and killed on the rooftop, his body sprawled across the tiles, his final attempt at freedom cut short. For Colombia, his death was both a relief and a reckoning. Crowds gathered to see his body, some cheering, others mourning. To the poor, he was still remembered as a man who gave them homes and food. To the rest of the nation, he was the architect of years of violence. Pablo Escobar's reign ended not with the grandeur he once embodied, but with the image of a fallen fugitive, surrounded by the city he had both built and destroyed. Pablo Escobar's death on December 2nd, 1993, marked the end of one of the most violent eras in Colombia's history. Yet the aftermath was as complex as the man himself. News of his death spread across Medellin within hours, drawing crowds into the streets. Some gathered in celebration, relieved that the long nightmare of bombings, assassinations, and terror might finally be over. Others came to mourn, remembering Escobar not as a criminal, but as a benefactor who had given them homes, schools, and opportunities when the government had ignored them. His funeral reflected this contradiction. Tens of thousands attended, filling the cemetery and surrounding streets. Mothers held their children aloft to see the man they had been told was a hero, while others whispered that his end was long overdue. Images of the crowd stunned the world, a nation divided, grieving and celebrating at the same time. For the government, Escobar's death was both a victory and a warning. The Medellin cartel, once feared as the most powerful criminal organization in the world, had collapsed. Its networks were fractured, its leaders killed or imprisoned, and its influence greatly diminished. Yet the underlying conditions that had allowed Escobar to rise, poverty, corruption, and global demand for cocaine, remained. The vacuum left by his death was quickly noticed. Rival organizations, especially the Cali cartel, moved to expand their control over the drug trade. Though less flamboyant and violent than Escobar, they proved equally effective at smuggling cocaine, shifting the balance of power but not eliminating the industry. Internationally, the fall of Escobar was hailed as a major achievement in the fight against narcotics. The United States praised Colombia's efforts and emphasized the importance of cooperation between nations. But analysts also pointed out that Escobar's death did not end the flow of cocaine into North America and Europe. The trade was too profitable, too entrenched to vanish with one man. For the people of Medellin, life after Escobar carried mixed emotions. The violence that had defined the 1980s began to ease, and neighborhoods slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. Yet memories of car bombs, assassinations, and daily fear lingered. The city carried scars, physical and emotional, that would take decades to heal. Families who had benefited from Escobar's charity continued to speak of him with gratitude, while victims of his terror remembered him with bitterness. His dual legacy, villain and savior, remained embedded in the national consciousness. Pablo Escobar's story had ended on a rooftop, but the questions he left behind about power, corruption, and morality would continue to haunt Colombia for generations. After Pablo Escobar's death, the focus of public attention shifted to his family. His wife, Maria Victoria Henao, and their two children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, were suddenly thrust into a world of uncertainty. Once shielded by Escobar's immense wealth and influence, they now lived under the shadow of his legacy and the threat of his enemies. The family was forced into hiding almost immediately. Los Pepis, still active after Escobar's death, targeted his relatives and associates, determined to erase any remnants of his empire. Properties were destroyed, businesses dismantled, and those connected to Escobar lived in constant fear of retribution. For Maria Victoria, survival became the priority. She sought asylum abroad, approaching several countries in search of refuge. The United States and many European nations refused, wary of granting protection to the family of the world's most notorious drug lord. Eventually they found temporary shelter in Mozambique before finally settling in Argentina under assumed names. Life in exile was a stark contrast to the opulence they had once known. They lived quietly, avoiding attention, trying to blend into ordinary society. For Juan Pablo, who later changed his name to Sebastian Marroquin, the transition was especially difficult. He carried the burden of his father's name, often facing suspicion and hostility. Over time, however, he sought to redefine himself. He pursued a career in architecture and eventually began speaking publicly about his father's legacy. His books and documentaries presented a personal perspective, not to glorify Escobar, but to understand and caution against the consequences of his choices. Manuela, the youngest, struggled with the trauma of losing her father and the instability of exile. Protected by her mother and brother, she largely withdrew from the public eye, choosing a life of privacy far removed from the violence of her childhood. For the family, adjusting to a world without Escobar meant more than financial changes. It meant reconciling love for the man they knew with the reality of the harm he caused. Maria Victoria described her husband as a devoted father and partner, while acknowledging the destruction tied to his empire. Their story became one of survival and reinvention, a reflection of how deeply Escobar's actions had affected not only a nation, but also his closest kin. In Colombia, debates over Escobar's memory continued. For some, his family's exile symbolized the final dismantling of his power. For others, their survival kept alive the human dimension of a man who had been both feared and adored. Even in death, Escobar's influence lingered, shaping the lives of those who bore his name and the country he had left scarred. In the years following Pablo Escobar's death, Colombia entered a difficult process of recovery. The immediate sense of relief was undeniable. Bombings in Bogotá and Medellín subsided, political assassinations slowed, and daily life no longer carried the same shadow of unpredictable terror. Yet the wounds left behind by Escobar's reign were deep, and healing them required more than his absence. Medellín, the city most associated with his empire, faced the greatest challenge. During Escobar's peak, the city had been known as the murder capital of the world, its neighborhoods scarred by constant violence. After his fall, the government made deliberate efforts to reclaim the city from the grip of crime. Programs were introduced to improve housing, education, and infrastructure in the barrios that Escobar had once controlled through his so-called philanthropy. These initiatives sought to replace his influence with lasting opportunities, slowly rebuilding trust between citizens and institutions. On a national scale, Colombia also strengthened its security forces. The government, supported by US aid through initiatives like Plan Colombia, invested heavily in counter-narcotics operations. Police and military units were trained and equipped to dismantle the remaining cartels, particularly the Cali cartel, which had risen in power after Escobar's death. This shift helped to reduce the dominance of any single organization, though smaller groups continued to operate. The justice system, long undermined by corruption and intimidation, faced its own reckoning. Efforts were made to protect judges, prosecutors, and journalists, ensuring that cases against organized crime could proceed without fear of instant reprisal. These reforms were imperfect and often slow, but they marked a step toward rebuilding the rule of law. Socially, Escobar's legacy created a divide. Many Colombians wanted to move forward, rejecting the glorification of his image and condemning the devastation he caused. Others, especially in poor neighborhoods that had benefited from his charity, continued to view him with a sense of nostalgia. This tension complicated the process of national healing, as the myths around Escobar often overshadowed the reality of his violence. Internationally, Colombia worked to repair its reputation. The country had become synonymous with cocaine and cartel violence, and leaders sought to present a new image of resilience and progress. Tourism campaigns, economic reforms, and cultural initiatives were launched to show the world that Colombia was more than Escobar's shadow. Over time, Medellín became a symbol of transformation. The city invested in libraries, parks, and public transportation, turning once dangerous areas into spaces of innovation and community. This renewal was not easy, nor was it immediate, but it reflected a determination to build a future no longer defined by one man's empire. Escobar's death had closed a chapter, but the story of Colombia's recovery was only just beginning. In the years after Pablo Escobar's death, his story did not fade into silence. Instead, it began to transform into legend, spreading through books, documentaries, films, and later television series. Around the world, people who had never set foot in Colombia came to know his name, often through dramatized retellings that blended fact with myth. Escobar, once a feared criminal, became a cultural figure, a symbol of ambition, excess, and the dangers of unchecked power. Early accounts focused on the violence and chaos of his reign, highlighting his role in turning Colombia into a battlefield. Journalists, many of whom had risked their lives covering his activities, published detailed investigations. These works sought to document the truth, emphasizing the scale of the destruction he left behind. Yet as time passed, storytellers outside Colombia began shaping his image differently. In movies and television, Escobar was often portrayed as a complex anti-hero, ruthless yet charismatic, violent yet strangely human. Productions like Narcos brought his story to millions of viewers worldwide, blending historical events with dramatized dialogue that emphasized his cunning and contradictions. For some, this popularized version risked romanticizing his crimes, presenting him as a figure of fascination rather than condemnation. In Colombia, the response to this cultural wave was divided. Many citizens resented the glorification of a man responsible for so much pain. Families of victims protested when they saw Escobar's image on t-shirts or posters, arguing that turning him into entertainment trivialized their suffering. Others, however, acknowledged that global interest in his story also drew attention to Colombia's resilience and its struggle to rebuild. Escobar's story became a mirror through which the world viewed broader themes: the destructive force of the drug trade, the corruption of institutions, and the clash between poverty and wealth. His life raised questions about morality, ambition, and the thin line between fear and admiration. In the barrios of Medellin, myths about him continued to circulate long after his death. Some remembered him as a saint-like figure who provided food, money, and shelter. Murals painted on crumbling walls kept his image alive, showing him as both protector and outlaw. Tourists, drawn by curiosity, began visiting sites associated with him, from his luxurious Hacienda Nápoles to the rooftops where his life ended. This narco-tourism became controversial, welcomed by some as a source of income, condemned by others as exploitation of tragedy. Ultimately, the spread of Escobar's legend demonstrated how stories can outlive the facts. The real man, with all his contradictions and cruelties, was gone. What remained was a narrative reshaped by memory, grief, fascination, and commerce. Escobar had terrorized a nation, but in death, he became a global myth, one that continues to spark debate over the line between remembering history and rewriting it. Pablo Escobar's death did not end the flow of cocaine. Instead, it reshaped the global drug trade. With the Medellin cartel shattered, other groups rushed to fill the vacuum. Chief among them was the Cali cartel, a rival organization that had long competed with Escobar but preferred a quieter, less flamboyant approach. While Escobar relied on terror and spectacle, the Cali leaders worked like businessmen, bribing officials, embedding themselves in legitimate industries, and avoiding the constant spotlight. For several years after Escobar's fall, the Cali cartel became the dominant force in cocaine trafficking. They built vast networks reaching into Mexico, the United States, and Europe, moving even greater volumes of drugs than Medellin at its peak. Unlike Escobar, who centralized power, the Cali cartel operated more like a corporation with multiple leaders and carefully divided responsibilities. This made them harder to dismantle, though eventually Colombian and US authorities would succeed in breaking them apart. As the 1990s progressed, another shift occurred. Mexican cartels, once middlemen in the chain, began taking control of distribution. Groups like the Sinaloa cartel learned from Escobar's rise and fall, studying both his successes and his mistakes. They realized that drawing too much attention invited destruction, and so they diversified operations, spreading routes across entire regions. Over time, Mexico replaced Colombia as the primary corridor for cocaine entering the United States. Still, Escobar's influence lingered. His methods of intimidation, his philosophy of plata o plomo, and his use of extreme violence to bend governments set a precedent that other traffickers would adopt. His story served as both inspiration and caution. To some in the underworld, Escobar was a model of ambition. To others, he was a reminder that unchecked arrogance led to downfall. Globally, governments adapted their strategies in response to the lessons of Escobar. Intelligence sharing between nations increased, anti-money laundering laws grew stricter, and specialized task forces were developed to prevent another figure from gaining such unchecked power. The so-called war on drugs intensified, with billions spent on interdiction, eradication, and enforcement. Yet critics argued that despite Escobar's death and the dismantling of his cartel, the underlying dynamics of the drug trade remained unchanged. Demand for cocaine in wealthy nations continued, ensuring that supply chains would always reappear. For Colombia, Escobar's legacy in the drug trade was both a curse and a turning point. While his death brought an end to an era of spectacular violence, it did not free the country from the shadow of narco-trafficking. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, where power shifted but the cycle of smuggling, corruption, and violence endured. Escobar was gone, but the empire he helped build had already spread beyond him, adapting and evolving in ways even he might not have imagined. In the years after Escobar's death, Colombia faced the immense challenge of confronting his legacy within its own borders. While the violence of the Medellin cartel had subsided, the cultural and social imprint of Escobar remained deeply woven into the fabric of the nation. For many, he was a symbol of pain, a reminder of car bombs, assassinations, and daily fear. For others, especially those in poor neighborhoods who had benefited from his gifts, he lingered as a figure of conflicted admiration. This divide made reconciliation difficult. The government recognized the need to reclaim the narrative. Efforts were made to remove Escobar's image from public spaces, dismantling symbols of his influence. Properties once owned by him were seized, repurposed, or demolished. His luxurious estate, Hacienda Nápoles, was transformed into a theme park and zoo, stripped of its connection to his persona and marketed instead as a family attraction. Yet these measures could not erase memory. In Medellin's barrios, stories of Escobar continued to circulate. Some residents recalled him as a man who built homes and provided food, while others remembered him as the reason for lost relatives and broken communities. The government introduced social programs to address poverty in these areas, aiming to replace Escobar's short-term gifts with lasting opportunities. Education and infrastructure became priorities, with libraries, transportation projects, and schools erected in neighborhoods once dominated by cartel violence. Over time, Medellin became a case study in urban transformation. Cable cars linked the steep hillsides to the city center, bringing marginalized communities into greater contact with opportunity. Cultural initiatives encouraged young people to pursue music, art, and technology instead of crime. This process did not erase the scars of the past, but it offered a path forward. At the same time, debates about Escobar's place in history intensified. Some Colombians argued for honest acknowledgement of his dual legacy, the man who terrorized and yet also gave. Others insisted that romanticizing him perpetuated harm. Documentaries, books, and school lessons began to frame him within the larger context of Colombia's struggle with inequality and corruption, emphasizing that his rise was possible only because of systemic failures. The victims of Escobar's violence also demanded recognition. Families of judges, journalists, and politicians killed during his reign sought memorials to honor their loved ones. Their voices pushed against the glamorization of Escobar, reminding society of the cost of his ambition. Slowly, Colombia worked to shift the focus from the man to the resilience of the people who survived him. The story of Medellin's rebirth, of communities reclaiming their future, became a counter-narrative to the myth of Escobar. His shadow remained, but it no longer defined the nation. Instead, Colombia began to tell a story of endurance, healing, and transformation in the face of one of history's darkest chapters. Decades after his death, Pablo Escobar remains one of the most polarizing figures in modern history. Around the world, His name is instantly recognizable, often spoken with a mix of fascination and revulsion. Popular media has kept his story alive, presenting him as a character both terrifying and strangely magnetic. Yet this global fascination has created tension within Colombia, where many citizens resent the way his image is commercialized or romanticized. In Medellin, this conflict is especially visible. Tourists from across the globe arrive hoping to see the places tied to Escobar's life: his former home, the rooftop where he was killed, and the neighborhoods he helped build. Tour operators have capitalized on this curiosity, creating narco tours that guide visitors through the city's dark past. While profitable, these tours spark controversy. Critics argue they glorify a man who destroyed countless lives, turning tragedy into entertainment. Supporters claim they serve as education, offering a chance to reflect on history and its consequences. Outside Colombia, Escobar's image has been commodified in even stranger ways. His face appears on t-shirts, posters, and merchandise, often stripped of context. In some circles, he is celebrated as a symbol of rebellion or ambition, a man who defied governments and built an empire from nothing. This distorted image ignores the devastation he caused, replacing the reality of bombs and assassinations with a myth of power and success. Scholars and writers often caution against this romanticization. They remind the world that Escobar's wealth came at the cost of thousands of lives and the destabilization of an entire country. Documentaries and academic works attempt to balance the narrative, showing not only his rise but also the suffering left in his wake. Still, myths prove resilient. For young people who did not live through his reign, Escobar can appear less as a historical figure and more as a legend shaped by pop culture. In Colombia, the debate about his legacy remains active. For the victims' families, reminders of Escobar are painful, reopening wounds that have never fully healed. For others, particularly those in marginalized communities who continue to struggle with poverty, his story reflects broader issues of inequality and the failure of institutions. Escobar's life and death are no longer just Colombian history. They have become part of global culture. He stands as a cautionary tale about ambition without limits, power without accountability, and wealth without conscience. Yet he also serves as an uncomfortable reminder of how societies sometimes turn criminals into icons, forgetting the human cost behind the myth. Medellin, once infamous as the stronghold of Pablo Escobar, has undergone one of the most remarkable transformations of any city in modern history. In the 1980s and early 1990s, it was known worldwide as the murder capital, a place where car bombs echoed through the streets and fear shaped daily life. After Escobar's death, however, local leaders, community activists, and ordinary citizens worked tirelessly to reclaim their city. Today, Medellin is often celebrated as a symbol of resilience and innovation. One of the key changes was the focus on urban integration. For decades, the poor barrios that sprawled across the steep hillsides had been isolated, both socially and physically, from the wealthier city centre. Escobar had exploited this gap by winning loyalty in these neighbourhoods. To counter this legacy, the city built cable cars and escalators that connected the hillsides to downtown, giving residents easier access to jobs, education, and healthcare. These projects were more than transportation. They were statements that the city belonged to everyone. Public spaces also played a central role in Medellin's rebirth. Libraries, parks, and cultural centres were constructed in areas once dominated by violence. These social urbanism projects gave young people alternatives to crime, offering places for study, recreation, and community gatherings. The city's leaders understood that breaking the cycle of violence required more than police. It required opportunity and dignity. Medellin's economy too began to shift. Once tied heavily to illicit activity, it diversified into technology, tourism, and education. Universities expanded, startups emerged, and international conferences were hosted, reshaping the city's global image. Tourists who once avoided Medellin now flock to it, drawn not only by curiosity about its past, but also by admiration for its progress. Yet the transformation was not without challenges. Crime did not vanish overnight. Smaller gangs continued to operate and poverty remained an issue in many areas, but the scale of violence diminished significantly, and Medellin became a model studied worldwide for how a city can rise from crisis. For many Colombians, the new Medellin represents hope, the idea that even the darkest legacies can be confronted and reshaped. Murals across the city honour victims, while community leaders speak openly about the past, ensuring that Escobar's shadow is acknowledged but not glorified. The city's identity is no longer tied solely to him. It is defined by the resilience of its people. Medellin's rebirth shows that while Escobar once terrorized a nation, he could not define its future. The city he tried to control has moved beyond his shadow, proving that healing and renewal are possible even after years of unimaginable violence. Remembering the victims of Pablo Escobar has become an essential part of Colombia's path toward healing. For decades, the focus of global attention often rested on Escobar himself, his wealth, his violence, his charisma. Yet behind every bombing, every assassination, and every act of terror were lives lost and families shattered. In recent years, Colombia has made conscious efforts to honour these victims, ensuring that their stories are not overshadowed by the myth of the man who caused their suffering. Memorials now stand in places once marked by violence. In Bogotá, plaques and monuments commemorate journalists, judges and politicians who stood against Escobar and paid with their lives. Their names are etched in stone as a reminder of the cost of defending justice in the face of fear. In Medellin, murals painted by local artists transform walls that once bore bullet holes into canvases of remembrance, telling stories of resilience and loss. These artistic tributes serve not only as memorials, but also as lessons for future generations, teaching them that violence must never again define their city. Families of victims play a vital role in preserving memory. Organisations formed by widows, children and relatives of those killed continue to advocate for recognition and justice. They speak in schools, participate in documentaries and write books, ensuring that their loved ones are remembered not as numbers in a statistic, but as human beings with dreams, hopes, and dignity. Their voices challenge the romanticised image of Escobar that sometimes circulates in popular culture, insisting on a fuller truth. Education has become another tool in shaping memory. In Colombian classrooms, students learn not only about Escobar's crimes, but also about the courage of those who opposed him. Teachers emphasise that the legacy of this era should not be reduced to the story of one man's power, but understood as a struggle of many who resisted and sought to build a better country. Internationally, too, efforts have been made to highlight victims' perspectives. Documentaries and investigative journalism increasingly focus on the human cost of Escobar's empire. These works remind global audiences that the fascination with his persona should never eclipse the pain he inflicted. The process of remembrance is ongoing and imperfect. Some wounds remain raw, and for many families closure will never fully arrive. Yet Colombia's commitment to honouring victims represents a conscious decision to move beyond fear. By elevating their stories, the nation transforms tragedy into testimony, ensuring that the legacy of Escobar is not just one of terror, but also of resilience. In this way, the memory of the victims shapes a narrative of dignity, reminding future generations that even in the darkest times, courage and humanity endure. The story of Pablo Escobar became more than Colombian history. It turned into a global lesson about crime, power, and the fragility of institutions. Governments, scholars, and ordinary citizens around the world studied his rise and fall, searching for answers to how one man could accumulate such influence and cause such destruction. The lessons, though painful, offered insights that extended far beyond Colombia's borders. One of the clearest lessons was the danger of systemic inequality. Escobar's early support came from communities that felt abandoned by the state. By providing housing, food, and schools, He filled a void left by government neglect. This demonstrated how poverty and exclusion can become fertile ground for criminal power. Nations recognized that fighting crime required not only police and soldiers, but also social investment in communities where despair creates opportunities for exploitation. Another lesson came from Escobar's use of corruption. He proved that institutions can be undermined not only through violence, but through money. Bribes eroded the justice system, compromised police forces, and silenced political opposition. Countries around the world responded by strengthening anti-corruption measures, protecting judges and journalists, and developing systems to track illicit financial flows. Escobar also showed the limits of brute force. The Medellin cartel's strategy of open terror, bombings, assassinations, kidnappings, brought temporary control but ultimately united the world against it. By contrast, rivals like the Cali cartel thrived for longer, precisely because they avoided spectacle. This highlighted the need for strategies that disrupt entire criminal networks, not just their leaders. Globally, the war on drugs intensified after Escobar's reign. Nations increased cooperation, sharing intelligence and resources to prevent another figure from reaching his level of dominance. Yet debates arose over the effectiveness of this approach. Critics argued that focusing on enforcement alone ignored the demand that fueled the trade. Escobar's story underscored the complexity of narcotics markets, where supply adapts to meet unrelenting consumption in wealthier nations. Culturally, his life became a cautionary tale about the seduction of power. Escobar began as a boy with limited means and limitless ambition. His empire showed how charisma and vision, when unchecked by morality, can lead to devastation. For young people drawn to the myth of his wealth, his ending, cornered, desperate, and killed on a rooftop, remains a stark reminder that such power is never sustainable. Perhaps the greatest lesson is that no empire, no matter how wealthy or violent, can outlast the determination of a people to reclaim their future. Escobar's reign brought suffering, but his downfall and Colombia's recovery showed the resilience of a nation unwilling to be defined forever by one man's crimes. Pablo Escobar's life continues to stand as a warning for future generations, a stark example of how unchecked ambition and power can destroy not only one man but an entire society. His story illustrates the dangers of seeking wealth and influence without regard for morality, law, or human life. For young people, especially in Colombia, Escobar is both a memory and a cautionary tale. Teachers, community leaders, and families speak of him not as a figure to admire, but as a reminder of the suffering he caused. His empire, built on violence and corruption, may have dazzled with its riches, but it collapsed under the weight of its own brutality. The lesson is clear. Power gained through fear is fragile, and wealth built on destruction cannot last. Escobar's ability to manipulate public perception also serves as a warning. By presenting himself as a benefactor to the poor, he masked the true cost of his actions. This reminds societies to be cautious of leaders or figures who use generosity as a tool to conceal darker motives. Real progress must come from justice and inclusion, not from gifts meant to buy silence or loyalty. On a broader level, Escobar's story warns governments of the risks posed by inequality and corruption. His rise was possible because communities felt abandoned and institutions were vulnerable to bribery. Strengthening democracy, protecting transparency, and investing in marginalized areas are lessons drawn directly from his legacy. Without these safeguards, the conditions that allowed Escobar to thrive could reappear in other forms, in other places. Internationally, Escobar remains a symbol of how global demand for drugs fuels cycles of violence far from where the substances are consumed. His empire existed because wealthy markets craved cocaine, and this demand funded terror in Colombia. The lesson here is collective responsibility. The consequences of consumption extend beyond borders, shaping lives in countries that may never see the profits but bear the suffering. For Colombia, the continued telling of Escobar's story is not meant to glorify but to teach. Museums, documentaries, and memorials present his life as a history of warning signs. Children growing up in Medellin today hear both about the horrors of his reign and the resilience of the city that survived him. His rooftop death, far from a heroic ending, underscores the inevitability of downfall for those who build empires on fear. Escobar's legacy endures not because he triumphed, but because his defeat highlights the costs of ignoring justice until it is almost too late. Future generations are urged to see him not as a role model, but as a caution, a reminder that ambition without ethics leads only to ruin. The story of Pablo Escobar, though rooted in Colombia's turbulent past, continues to echo in the present as both a national scar and a global lesson. For Colombia, his legacy is a reminder of how fragile institutions can be when confronted with corruption, inequality, and the lure of illicit wealth. The country has spent decades working to redefine itself, ensuring that its identity is not tied to one man's violence, but to the resilience of its people. Medellin, once synonymous with cartel warfare, now stands as a city of innovation and renewal, proof that even the darkest histories can be transformed into narratives of hope. Yet Escobar's shadow remains visible. His name still sparks debate between those who view him as a villain who brought unimaginable suffering, and those who remember him as a benefactor who offered what the state failed to provide. This tension reflects the complexity of his impact. To ignore the good he did for some is to dismiss the reality of poverty he exploited. To ignore the terror he unleashed is to dishonor the thousands of victims who paid the price for his ambition. Internationally, Escobar has become both a myth and a warning. Popular culture has elevated his story to global recognition, turning him into an icon of crime and excess. But beyond the dramatizations lies the true cautionary tale. The drug trade is not confined by borders, and the demand that fueled Escobar's empire still shapes the world today. His rise and fall reveal the interconnectedness of nations, where decisions in one country can create ripples of violence in another. For future generations, the meaning of Escobar's story is not in the glamour of his wealth or the audacity of his defiance, but in the consequences of his choices. He proved that fear can silence a nation, but not forever. He showed how corruption can hollow out institutions, but also how resilience can rebuild them. His end, alone, fleeing across rooftops, his empire in ruins, serves as the ultimate reminder that no power built on destruction endures. Today, Colombia honors its victims, invests in its communities, and shares its lessons with the world. The country's journey demonstrates that healing is possible, though never easy. Escobar's life is studied not to celebrate him, but to understand how to prevent another figure from rising in the same way. His story belongs not only to Colombia but to humanity, a testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition and the strength of those who refuse to be defined by terror. In the end, Pablo Escobar's greatest legacy may be the resilience of a nation that survived him, and the enduring truth that even the darkest shadows cannot extinguish the human will to endure, rebuild, and move forward.